Now with the introductions done with, for everybody, for all the spectators, I'd just like to read out the motion once. So the motion is the third one. This House believes that the developing world feminist movement should lobby for issues primarily based on their likelihood to succeed. With that done, I would now like to invite the Prime Minister to open the case for side government. Here.
Hi, can you guys confirm if I'm audible?
Yes.
Okay, lovely.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Apala. Do we have Nashra over here? She's a panelist. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
I guess I joined a little late, but I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, are we good? Can I start? Great. Just give me.
Can I get a confirmation if the screen is visible?
Yes, your screen is visible.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yep. Just give me 10 seconds and I'll start. Starting. I'm so sorry. Just give me 1 sec. I'll grab some water. Right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Anna, let's not have a messy finals. This debate is fundamentally about trade-offs. We think that parties and movements make trade-offs on either side of the house. Opposition needs to come and give us a metric or justify why we can fight for everything at every point in time, why we can defend multiple issues with the same movement that has a limited amount of resources. We think a counterfactual is necessary if they want to win this debate, right? Feminist movements, and let's get into characterization now. Feminist movements in the developing world manifest in different ways. We think it manifests in the terms of conversations, parliaments, panchayats, and protests, but the principle of all of that is different things can become like successful in different contexts. We think in developed nations, you've got nuanced understandings of what feminism looks like. For example, France can have pro-natalist advocacy today because people in France over the last 20 years have had a history of not wanting to have too many children. We think in that regard, context determine what is like fundamentally successful in like a particular country or a particular manifestation of the feminist movement's goal structure, right? In that regard, what is like deprioritized by the feminist movement will always be a non-static set of things, right? We think that the feminist movement, because of its inherent dynamism, can accommodate changes in context and reorient its goals. We think that through time, through generations, through context, priorities change, capacities change, potentials change. We think that trans rights for individuals in Pakistan was something that could happen because of a conversation that had come about because of like things like universality and equality becoming premises of that conversation. That conversation was never intellectually alienating, like saying that, hey, gendered identities are innate and structured and permeable and all that stuff. We think that they advocated for basic principle premises like, hey, universality and equality are important. And in that regard, our fourth idea when it comes to characterization, we think that what is likely to be deprioritized at the most basic level is always going to be a function of the language you use to talk about those needs. The accessibility to language, that you need to understand goals is the common denominator which decides what kind of like move by the feminist movement will necessarily be something that is well received and therefore has the potential to succeed. Let's give you an example of maternity leave. We think that why the rallying by feminist movements for maternity leave across the world, across spectrums, has largely succeeded is because it's so simple and so visceral to talk about the kind of trauma, the kind of labor, the kind of pain that a mother goes through when she goes ahead or when they go ahead and birth a child. We think that in that regard, that kind of language is inherently accessible, which makes like creating coalitions for like pushing change much easier. And in that regard, what do parameters of success look like? 4 ideas. Public support, what kind of bipartisan support you can generate, what kind of quantifiable outcomes you can push, and what kind of language you use, and that is built off of the characterization I gave you in the last minute, right? Public support, we think that the kind of traction and the kind of like resounding effect that your claims have in communities, social groups, and religious groups is particularly important in developing countries because these groups become the factors that decide the kind of like political traction your goals can go ahead and get. We think that therefore dissolving marriage as a structure is something that you're not likely to get consensus over, and therefore you're not likely to get any chance of succeeding at. We think that the ability to gauge what kind of feminist goals have the most kind of like traction or attention in status quo is simple through tools like social media. We don't think that's necessarily something that cannot happen, right? But let's also talk about bipartisan support in a country that's as like politically isolated and polarized as India is. We think that it's super important to not go ahead and like advocate for things that both parties that are in power, both like, and by parties we don't mean actual parties, but like ideologies that exist in status quo have no incentive to support. We think that therefore like the feminist movement advocating for shit like artificial wombs is pointless in status quo in that regard, because it has no ability to succeed, right? Then we also talked about issues that have the most immediate quantifiable outcomes or in offering you visible utility in social economic life. Here's where we think that issues like wage gap are so much more effective and so much more utilitarian on the basic principle that you can see trickle down benefits in real time when those issues are put and when those issues get manifested, right? And in that regard, we've also talked about fourthly, language, right? We think female feticide has the universal viscerality of like gaining a kind of sympathy, in that it's so much harder to defend your justification as to why you would kill babies than it is to justify why you follow certain norms in your wedding rituals. We think like those are the things that are likely to be deprioritized, but we've already told you why they won't be permanently deprioritized in that regard, right? Understand this debate has nothing to do with, or our metrics in this debate have nothing to do with privilege, right? We don't think average common feminism is the same thing as privileged feminism. Here's where we talked about framing. We think that movements have limited amounts of capital, and with that being said, movements need to prioritize goals that provide utility to their members. You need to use resources in a manner that give you the greatest outcome. All metrics are arbitrary panel. If like opposition is going to come and tell you, hey, we're going to prioritize the most urgent issue, we think in that context, even urgency is something that can be debated. Utility in that regard allows you like exclusivity of the benefit that gives the exclusive benefit that utility allows you is giving you the groundwork that you need for people to be more progressive feminists in the longer run. This looks like things as basic as education, as basic as sustainable income, as basic as the right to work and live the lives that they want to live. We think that real progress is much more important than castles in the air, because real progress gives you outcomes in terms of policies, but it also gives you traction, because once people see your movement succeeding, they're likely to associate with it, they're likely to be sympathetic towards it, they're likely to want to fund it, right? Let's move on to a constructive. I think that in that regard, 4 ideas, and all of these ideas will be built on by the rest of my speakers. You push basic rights on our side of the house. We think that women not being able to earn, study, choose the age that they want to marry are far more fundamental. Yourself, whoever's unmuted. We think that there are far more fundamental problems and problems that need immediate resolve. We think that, and the language to do that is very accessible. We think that going up to tell people that, hey, education is a basic right that you need to give to anyone is you leveraging the accessibility and universality of that language. We think in a world where you don't do this, you deprioritize the political needs and will of your stakeholders. We think that this is a list of goals that expands more effectively. We think that to go ahead and make radical demands like, hey, women should allow to should prefer a world where they are single mothers and can take care of their children on their own is premised on the fact that they have the material resources to do so. We think that kind of chronological progression of like needs and goals of the feminist movement is not something that gets absolutely jettisoned from the table on our side of the house. We think it's a dynamic rubric to begin with. We think the opportunity cost is something that opposition needs to take into consideration at all times, because a movement cannot conceivably fight for everything. But lastly, we think on their side of the house, you breed a movement that is elitist and so pregnant with intellectualism that it doesn't make it accessible to average women. Let's give you a comparative and preemptive argument in the last 30 seconds of the speech. We think that when you go ahead and talk about the counterfactual on their side of the house, if they don't provide you a metric, we think they're likely to push the issues of feminists who have the most privilege and have the most traction. And it's a gross misallocation of resources to begin with, A, but it's also in their world wherein the feminist movement becomes so alienated from its most primary stakeholders that feminists become humanists because of the disengagement with a framework that doesn't seem relatable to the average feminist and the kind of emancipation that they may require, right? We think that, and this is important for us to clarify, I will talk to you about this binary. We think that for disadvantaged women, they will still find safety in the feminist movement on our side of the house, because at worst, even if our benefits are just basic, they do have the capacity to trickle down because they are universal in their claims, right? In that regard, this debate is not a judgment within feminist circles of what is or isn't important. We think oppression Olympics is against what feminism stands for at all times, right? This debate is about what you strategically put at the top of your agenda when you start negotiating with parties who have an immense likelihood to not agree with the validity of your claims. And in that regard, by providing you the metrics that we think will allow the feminist movement to push for tangible changes in status quo, but push for the material conditions that allow you to then rally for more radical change in the future, we are the side where the feminist movement is better off in developing countries. We are proud to be on proposition.
All right, I thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. Now I would like to invite the Leader of Opposition to open case for side op. Here, here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, before I start, just a couple of things I wish to push forward and talk about. Slightly on a personal note, this is slightly an overwhelming moment for me personally, because those who have stuck by me for like a year and a half know the kind of troubled times that I individually have faced within the circuit with respect to not seeing a lot of success and like a tumultuous year in general. So I just want to take this moment and like express gratitude to the people who stood by. One of them is Ritvik is waiting with me right now. My DevSoc, SBS DevSoc, Sista Srinivas for always being there, and Aditya Serene, with who I also did Premchand last year. So it's really special for me at this point. And yeah, I think that's all from my side. Lots of love to the OC also for this wonderful tournament. Assuming I'm still audible, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel 2 large pushes from side proposition. Number 1, limited resources exist, therefore prioritization needs to happen on the basis of utility. Who defines that utility is question number 1 that they don't answer, because their answer to who defines utility is that, oh, utility is defined by which success, which movement is more likely to gain traction and have success in the first place. It's in this speech that you're going to really get to know as to what dictates this threshold of success and who dictates which movement and which issue is more likely to get success in the first place, and why that entire trope is problematic in the first place. But secondly, I don't understand why Apala doesn't want you to do prioritization on the basis of urgency. If the event and the issue of urgency is debatable, sure, go ahead, have discourse within your movement, talk about what is a more urgent need, what is a more pressing need, and like push for that, right? We don't think it's ever a problem on our side to like have a discourse and have a dialogue with respect to what kind of prioritization you want to do considering your limited resources. We don't contest on the limited resources aspect. The idea, however, on our side, the other distinction is that the moment you go ahead and do prioritization on basis of urgency instead of likelihood of success, you always go ahead and rally for things not on the basis of mass approval, but on basis of things which are more innate and more important to stakeholders that you cater to. Therefore, the kind of catering that this movement is now doing on our side vis-a-vis theirs is not to the masses, but to the people within the movement. We think that's net benefit on our side of the house. But secondly, and this is their large push in this debate, they say that, look, in the absence of like a counterfactual, this movement is largely inaccessible to average women, because it's going to be the privileged women within the movements whose ideas and whose demands are going to be like prioritized and pushed for in the first place. We think two responses to that. Firstly, we think that's largely inexclusive, because note what happens on their side also, right? Along with propensity of like greater likelihood of being successful, we think they also on their side of the house also things which are like more suitable for the privileged within the movement are the ones which are being pushed forward in the first place. Because on a comparative emancipation of a Brahmin woman versus emancipation of a Dalit woman, look at the likelihood of success in that and just compare for yourself that which is being. Okay, someone's unmuted. Can you please stop the timer? Okay. I think it's fair. Cool. Resuming in 3, 2, 1. Likelihood of success, even on their side of the house, goes ahead and pushes for things like privileged people within the movement going ahead and pushing for their demands. I don't see why that's an exclusive house within our movement. At that point in time, when you have not been able to justify to me as to why this prioritization on the basis of utility is what you want to go ahead and do, and secondly, that the moment where your harm is rather largely inexclusive, we think all this on proposition literally stands stagnant at this point. Having said that, what do you get from opposition in this debate? And this is where this debate really starts, right? 1 clarification, 3 problems, and 3 reasons on our side for which you still go ahead and rally for causes, even if the likelihood of success, as proposition would like you to believe, is low. Firstly, with clarification, what is the metric of this success? And this is extremely important, because Apala lists down some metrics for you, but doesn't really explain them. The one metric, though, that we agree with them is the kind of mass appeal and the public support you get. ahead. That is to say, what defines your likelihood of success is what already has a positive public perception in the masses in the first place. This rather looks like conservative notions. This rather looks like things like with already orthodox people already have like a positive inclination for, which they have which have greater viability within them. Things like LGBTQI movement never getting pushed by feminist movements on their side, because literally, they don't have the similar kind of public approval, and therefore their likelihood of ever being successful, or issues regarding issues along similar lines which do not agree with public with mass approval, are things which you never go ahead and push for in propositions world. This is literally what is the most important thing in this debate. Having justified that, 3 problems on proposition that I'm going to talk to you about. Firstly, with respect to the threshold being defined by majority, and why is that problematic? Because the moment you go ahead and let the majority decide the likelihood of success, and therefore value and pass a value judgment, and like have enormous amount of influence on what kind of movements and what kind of discourse you have within your movement, we think you literally go ahead and like co-opt into the structure which you wanted to separately exist from in the first place. At that point in time, what literally happens to your movement as an end goal is an appeasement of the majority, literally goes against your movement in the first place. Thirdly, third problem we think with going ahead and like giving this power to the majority is with respect to sending out a narrative that it's the majority which went ahead and approved of your emancipation. This narrative is again something that needs to be rejected at the word go. Second problem with respect to like fall in discussion or say rallying of radical changes. Basic things like laws against marital rape, or things like sanitary period leaves, etc., are things which might be very normal in developed countries, but these are things which are still seen as radical changes or radical reforms in these developing countries. At that point in time, the reason that you never go ahead and rally for these things in propositions world, despite the fact that these are still basic needs for women within your movement and within that state, is the reason is simple, that you're never going to go ahead and have mass approval for that cause, and therefore you are more likelihood to go ahead and like probably rally for like 30 more seats in a metro rather than going ahead and rallying for issues which are more urgent, more pressing. But largely, we think also what's problematic necessarily is that we think at all points in time, look at what history also tells you, right? Things like suffrage, things like wage gap, things like protest, the idea of protest in the first place, these are all concepts which have largely less likelihood of success even in the first place to begin with. The likelihood of a protest being successful in a country like India, or for that matter of fact any developing country, is anyway so less. Therefore proposition also has to take on the burden that we are not even going to go ahead and protest, because literally the likelihood of success of your protest is also so largely restricted. Then lastly, the third idea with this third harm with respect to loss of allies. We think the moment you go ahead and like declare yourself as a movement which doesn't want to go ahead and upset the masses, you literally have gone ahead and lost allies in the form of like probably LGBTQI movements, who probably sought refuge within your movement and sought support from your movement. But not only is that betrayal problematic on principle level, but secondly, we think also that losing those allies is necessarily problematic for the propagation of your movement also. At that point, why are we still okay with you going ahead and rallying for causes which might not have the same likelihood of success as something else? Because we want to find value in resistance. We want to go ahead and give you aspirational value with respect to like envisaging a better world. We don't want you to believe as an individual within the movement that the world is as bad as it can be, and probably all that things that you are allowed to do are based on the consent of the masses, are based on the consent of the majority who doesn't agree with you, who doesn't want your emancipation at all points. That we don't think aspirational value can ever exist on proposition. We don't think that there can ever be found a value within resistance in and of itself on proposition. We don't think we want to live in a world as hopeless as that of proposition. We are extremely proud to oppose.
I thank the leader of opposition for that fine speech. Now I'd like to call the DPM to extend the case for side government. Here.
All right, I'm sorry for the delay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. In short, opposition's case is an over-ambitious case of how you shouldn't bend and succumb to the priorities of majorities because as a movement that's bad. There is little tangible or utility that flows out of the opposition's case in terms of what's likely going to happen. We have simple priorities, and I'm going to push for two things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to expand upon Apala's idea on what utility looks like, what are the metrics that define utility, and secondly, I'm going to talk about what is the potential counterfactual, and we're more than happy to appease to majority given that that's the best way for you to achieve political, social, and institutional change. Let's first talk about their first contention, who defines utility. I think there were 4 exhaustive metrics that Apala gave you, which are more than enough for you to adjudicate this clash. First metric on this is that it's based upon how much religious, social, cultural, and community-based organizations are willing to lend their support to you. At that point, it's also worth noting out that not every social and cultural community is dogmatic and is archaic. To a large degree, you'll also find small pockets of organizations that are more liberal and more progressive. So for every small community that you might think is bad, there are also countervailing communities that are willing to lend your support to it. I don't think at large you can generalize society that it's a whole box of people who have never understood any liberal or progressive values. In that, you can still find support. But more importantly, even the most archaic and dogmatic people can still support your basic rights. I'll elaborate more this in my constructive part, but that is something that we're still willing to do. How do you get to decide that? It's through social media. You can look towards others mass media channels and gauge that what are the interests and issues that people are more likely to support and issues they are less likely to support. That can still be gauged through different platforms. Secondly, bipartisan support, because at the end of the day, if you don't have legislative change, trust me, the majority of your changes wouldn't matter. You can just simply argue about those things, but neither institutionally or now culturally, no one is going to acknowledge your rights to begin with. Thirdly, does it have any contribution to social and economic life? Because it's important. People do to a large extent are kind of happy and infatuated with the concept of utility in their minds. So if you tell people that let women work, let women get educated, that contributes to your economy. In that instance, people are more likely to send their girl child for further education because families also realize they have more disposable income. That's why those tangible impacts convert and change the minds of people. Apala was crystal clear on those impacts. What is the counterfactual? Prioritize urgency. What defines urgency? And at that point, I'm likely going to say 4 things to that. First of all, I think a lot of issues are equally urgent. I don't see how you can make a value judgment on the basis of urgency. Women who have been facing discrimination on the basis of their sex and gender are also an issue that you ought to prioritize, but also women who are facing the wrath of interreligious marriage also ought to prioritize. At that instance, there is no quantification. On contrary, we would say that likelihood of success is an easy quantifiable metric that you can choose. But secondly, I think what's likely going to happen is that a lot of issues are just collapsing and there is a conflicting interest of different issues. You're just going to burn out. You won't be able to decide which issue that you eventually want to prioritize, because make no mistake, urgency isn't some one side concept which you can just define and quantify in one particular instance. There was more counterfactual required on that. Besides that, I think your movement will look more unorganized, more haphazardous if it's just urgency, because urgency can also extend to a host of different issues. Thirdly, for the argument of appeasing majority, you need to understand the context of developing countries. What are these countries? They're still fledgling democracies with new democratic structures, with new judiciary, with new executives. In that instance, these countries don't have that many liberal values and are largely still controlled and have an influence of old structures. Our case was simple. I think when you make your claim on the basis of likelihood of success, what you're going to base itself on is the basic rights. Why are the basic rights most likely to be progressed on our side of the house? Something that Pratyush doesn't deal with. The reason is simple, because basic rights are universal, they're innate to human being, and they are something that aren't very specific to your gender or sex. In those instances, it's easy to galvanize and mobilize around those issues, and thereby they're the issues which are most likely going to prioritize. So we aren't overshooting for things like artificial wombs or dissolving the structure of patriarchy by abolishing marriages and abolishing family structures, something that you will actively see in West feminist movement is arguing for. That is why quantifiable success is likely going to prioritize the most basic and most disadvantaged people. In that instance, why is it important to appease majority? For a couple of simple reasons. One, if you don't have individuals who are willing to be your allies and vote on behalf of you, vote for your issues, make politicians hear their voice, become voting blocks so that you can pressurize politicians through electoral process, no politician is ever going to listen to you. But more importantly, through cultural change as well. The perception of people is never going to change to you unless you try to make some sort of commonality between you and different structures. At that instance, I think this is more likely going to take place. But let's talk about why the kind of sacrifice that you're going to make to appease majority isn't as draconian as the opposition claims. There are a couple of reasons to believe that. First of all, any rational person is going to agree that anything such as female feticide is just bad. It's abhorrent by its nature. There are certain rights which are endowed to human beings the moment they are born. And some of those rights are women having educational rights, women getting equal pay, women getting equal recognition for their work. In that instance, when you argue on the basis of these things, because they're most likely to successful, because most people can rally around them, because there's some utility associated to it, there is a mass popular support for these issues. What's happening in developing countries is that you have almost leapfrogged all the basic issues and you've started talking about some fancy concept concept that you have largely opted from the Western feminism and have started talking about the issues with no ground understanding. As a consequence, you have alienated the most core issue or core constituency of your feminist movement, women who are largely concentrated within the rural areas, of women who don't have direct access to the feminist movement. This is why the issues that are highest likelihood of success are the ones that are dealing with the universal and basic rights, which means they are the ones that are most going to be prioritized. What is its impact on your social movement? There are multiple impacts. One, it strengthens your movement by working on tangible policies and making real-time progress, as opposed to making policies which literally air in the castle kind of policies, which means your movement looks more successful, and therefore your movement gets more visibility, more allies for your movement who are willing to support you in a host of different issues. This also helps build your material base, because how do you ask for rights? You start from basic rights and then you move on to other rights. That's how we also tackle their idea that you'll never be able to achieve something meaningful in terms of emancipation. When you start from basic rights, such as right to have education and right to be able to literally breathe in majority of the cases, you'll start be able to move towards more progressive rights for your side, which means your movement can build a much better strong base and then start moving from that point onwards, because you have more allies who would be willing to support you. Thirdly, it also gets rid of privileged feminism that they're most concerned about, because how do you capture the feminist movement more likely? Because when you talk about concepts that aren't as popular, because most of your privileged feminism concepts are ones which are concerning to a few group of people, which means they're less likely to be supported by other people, so they'll get automatically eliminated because they're less likely to be successful to begin with. So the concept of privileged feminism, or feminism that is just simply accumulated habits of you, is less likely to take place. Secondly, it's also it becomes less easy for others to villainize your movement. This is true because in a lot of cases you often prioritize issues that aren't really as important to you, but oftentimes they are so radical in nature, as I told you, artificial womb, or like you should abolish marriage because marriage by nature is patriarchal. And to some degree, I'm also happy to bite the bullet and say that in rural areas we would instead save the lives of women, as opposed to say work upon abolishing interreligious marriage, because in a lot of cases the basic rights that you can get from them are far more important. But when you work upon unrealistic and unsuccessful ideas, people constantly villainize and ostracize you. They'll say, look, you're asking for way too much and we aren't willing to negotiate as much, which means you aren't willing to come even halfway for us. In those instances, you get further ostracized for making too much, for asking too much in terms of rights and movements. Thirdly, it's also an easy sell, because as I said, unlike all other things they can mention to you, success can be easily quantified for all the exhaustive metrics that Apala and I also extended upon. In those instances, it's an easy sell to women within your social movement. But keep in mind, feminism movement will still remain a cathartic space for majority of the women. Just because your lobbying priorities are different doesn't mean that you don't allow other women to be a part of the space. Very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech. Now I request the Deputy Leader of Opposition to extend the case for side op. Here.
All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, let's be very clear. Their case doesn't leave cities in developing worlds. Their case doesn't deal with harsh realities of what happens to women in rural areas when they go ahead and ask for rights. And in their world, this aim to uplift women in rural areas is unachievable. It's unrealistic. It's irrational to conceive a world where women in rural areas do go ahead and get rights. Because what can you achieve? For some reason, they've painted this bad comparative that we have to somehow defend dissolving marriage to them going ahead and rallying for achieving basic human rights. Hello, there's some amount of reasonability that you ask for causes on our front as well. They seem less reasonable because of the context you'll place them in. Pratyush gave you examples. I'm going to add here to that. What did Pratyush tell you? The anatomy of causes that you argue for in the developing world is as follows. Trigger warning. You don't have laws against marital rape in countries like India. You don't have police cells for sexual harassment in police stations. You don't have debates about what it means on female mutilation, what it's like for women to go through female feticide, they see their own child being dropped, what it's like to have abortion rights in India. That's something that they needed to deal with. These claims seem radical to them. They're not when you have to go ahead and place them in a context of this developing world that we're speaking about. They can't claim that we have to defend dissolving marriage against going ahead and fighting for basic human rights that they apparently stand for. We too can go ahead and argue the same. But here's the thing. The biggest problem in that utility analysis is that a lot of causes that have actually been realized would never have been realized if they weren't conceived of to begin with. Because this debate is not about don't fight for everything. This debate is about what plausible cause can you seem as conceivably achievable world? Do you do it on what you desire to achieve, or do you do it on what your oppressor is most likely to crave in as? No, because we think you go ahead and as women decide what you want to go ahead and do, the kind of world that you want to go ahead and live in, not the kind of world where your oppressor and the structure is most likely to go ahead and give you rights. You as a feminist movement ask for an overhaul of the pre-existing ideology that has been coming through centuries, and they're going ahead and making the movement bang down, drop into the same pit hole, but they're going to go ahead and cater to this utilitarian metric of what happens when the oppressor goes ahead and says, yeah, you can have this. This is what I put my finger on. You ask for this, have this. But here's the bigger thing. Urgency is something that they don't target. 377 was abrogated in India, was abolished, was decriminalized. We think these causes of these issues, specifically in racist and homophobic states like our country, weren't or wouldn't have been reasonably rational because of no utilitarian benefit. And that's their exact metric, right? You provide me no utility, therefore I won't go ahead and lobby for it. Well, hello, you didn't provide a cause any utility because the number of people that it benefited was sure small, but that community still got emancipation. It got institutional change, it got cultural change. You've seen economic emancipation of LGBTQ communities. How do you go ahead and provide that fragment of society any kind of urgency in their world when all you have to prove greater numbers to greatest benefit to greatest numbers? We don't know. End of story. Why our world? 5 reasons I'm going to give you why our world. Firstly, the idea of hope. The feminist movement, specifically the second wave of feminism, is based on this simple idea. It's collective suffering and collective upliftment. 2 problems when you go ahead and buy into their world. When you're going ahead and lobbying for a cause, who gives it legitimacy is the first thing. The people. The people back those causes up, and we agree that there's a certain amount of mass palatability that they have to go ahead and cater to immensely. And on our front, we also have to do in the forms of allies. 2 problems when you go ahead and say that I'm going to cater to the majority of society. A, the legitimacy of the cause comes from the fact that it's probably a cause that is achievable, not a cause that is justified in and of itself. The problem with this is that the rhetoric that you go ahead and now translate in society is don't ask for something that you can't get. You've gone ahead and destroyed the hope for innumerable women who can probably never see themselves uplifted simply now because their cause is something that doesn't seem reasonable to a few select group of women. Second, success. We think their idea of success is oppressor conceding to demands. We say success is dreaming of an unachievable cause in itself. It's dreaming of the reimagination and the overhaul of an already patriarchic world. Thirdly, if you never rally for causes that seem unachievable, you'll never get that world. It's quite simple. This is the concept of an overturned window that I'm going to talk about here. How is change meted out? You ask for radical measures, radical like asking for sexual harassment cells. All right, if people don't concede to this, their idea of, listen, you're probably going to get the most probable thing, which is having a police women officer, is something that you're going to get also on our world. But what you started out was asking for a more broader, overarching perspective of what the movement and what women in general wanted, not what a select group of individuals and women wanted. 4th problem with their world. Resistance is validated by the end being justified, and not because you'll get it, because ends in themselves are what are justified. The problem in their world is twofold. You've given up the desire to create your own world, and secondly, you never seek, and you seek whatever you can scrape through or whatever your oppressor will give you. It's human to want a world you want to live in simply because your oppressor never had to worry about the same or what these people will think. We think you should go ahead and do the same. The world needs to be equal for you. What is this debate then about? It's a commentary on what you think is legitimate to ask for and what you should base it on. What are the obvious problems that we do away with? 1, these movements, which are for the purposes of upliftment of general women mass, become colonialists themselves. That is, you going ahead and telling a person, don't resist colonization because you'll never be able to go ahead and kick them out of your country. We think this rhetoric breeds helplessness. This rhetoric breeds absolution to, or you just like resistant, breeds succumbing to the kind of pressures that exist because of the oppressive structure. We think this rhetoric goes ahead and devoids or makes individuals all devoid of any catharsis. Secondly, palatability of causes. We already talked to you about that. How do you go ahead and quantify this success? What is this threshold of success? For them, it's utility. Where is this utility seen? Their only example is maternity leave. Maternity leave happens in very liberal spaces like office spaces, like corporate spaces. How are they going ahead and dealing with causes that actually govern people that most individuals go ahead and face? People whistling at them on the streets. How do you go ahead and rally for these causes on their word when these causes don't seem as urgent to the kind of women who decide the success or this threshold of success? These are women with resources. These are women who exercise more control of power within and outside the movement. These are groups which exercise autonomy within this intersectional movement. These are groups which operate in a context of the liberal bubble, like this debating circuit. For example, this is the biggest problem. They don't go ahead and break down any kind of barriers, but rather focus on causes which are more reasonable to achieve. You've taken away hope from people who were, as it is, less likely to achieve their ends. And you, on this end of the spectrum, are individuals who were drastically more likely to be able to achieve their end. But at the same time, you've gone ahead and made causes seem such a way that, listen, at the end of the day, what you want and what you'll give us is what we'll take. We think that rhetoric is excessively problematic. It's excessively important that you go ahead and deal with this idea that, listen, don't fight for everything. No, dream the world that you want to live in. We're very proud to oppose.
I thank the DLO for that fine speech. Now I'd like to call upon the government whip to summarize the case for SideGov. Here.
Okay, I'm just double checking. I'll start in 10 seconds.
Yes, you're clearly audible.
Perfect. I'll just
put
on my timer. Oh my God, what is this phone? All right. Internet. Start for me. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. I don't know as a woman what is the value of dreams if they're not equally accessible to everyone. That is, everyone in a developing country has the ability to dream. And for that, you need access to the ability to be socially convinced that things like education are important for women to begin with. What this debate is then going to be about is twofold. One, on opposition to questions we don't have answer to. What is the value of pursuing something that will never materialize? But second, what is so core to feminism that you will drop it while appealing to the majority? Because they think somehow the feminist movement will become unfeminist in nature the minute they start appeasing to majority. In our worst case, we don't think that will happen, and we don't think that is a charitable version of this debate whatsoever. That is not what this debate is about. But secondly, here's what I'm going to talk to you about in my speech. I'm going to talk to you about why there was no definition on the engagement of utility that you get from opposition. Second, I'm going to talk to you about what are the kind of things that can be like in terms of judicial recourse that can exist in our world. Lastly, I'm going to define that counterfactual, which is completely absent insofar as they've mentioned it in the first speech and absolutely forgot it in their second speech. We think they need to do a better job in op-whip, and that's too late for them to win this debate. But first, on the engagement of utility, we think this is two problems. Utility isn't just numbers, and they really get away with misconstruing our case. And they say, oh, things like sexual harassment and female feticide are something that exists in their world. Apala was very clear in her speech. We think in this debate and the world you live in, what is deprioritized is never going to be static. So it's never going to be one thing that's actively deprioritized as less successful in our world. We think this changes in context, in countries, in through generations and through decades, which means right now, like Pakistan literally has transgender identity rights and like semi-citizenship for transgender individuals. And this is because it was easy to opt into the language of universality. More on that later. And therefore, it wasn't radical. Therefore, the likelihood of succeeding within that is more likely. Similarly, 10 to 20 years ago, 377 wouldn't be likely at all, which means in our world right now, it's like because you had people in the parliament, in the judiciary, and judicial recourse is possible in our world, because it happened, you were able to live in a world particularly where you had certain amount of benefits accruing to you because there were people in the judiciary who favored these causes. And that's what we mean by likelihood of success. We gave you 3 to 4 reasons, no response to that whatsoever, no counter-characterization either, so we assume it stands. One, the idea of social and cultural ability to convince someone, and this is important. But secondly, the ability for you to pass laws. How many people can lobby for you in the government? How many non-cis males are there in your parliament seats? These are important, and this is what led to things like 377 and transgender rights as well. But next, I'm going to talk to you about things like why we're okay with biting the bullet. We think we're okay to bite the bullet and say some forms of hope in nuanced forms of feminism are significantly reduced or like delayed in our best case, because it comes at the cost of giving the right for everyone to imagine what they think feminism should look like. This can only happen in a world where you rally for universality and rally for basic rights, which are things like sexual harassment and marital rape, which are more visceral and therefore easy to convince upon someone against to begin with. Now I'm going to talk to you about defining utility versus urgency. We think, and this is important, and this is what we mean by the whims and fancies oppressor is a really false characterization on op. Who are these? Who is this majority? They're destitute, uneducated women who aren't a part of your feminist movement because they're severely alienated about your movement. Because you talk about multiple things at once, you talk about things that they don't understand. We think these are particularly important because we get no example of what it is that is non-success based in their side of the world, other than trying to co-opt our benefits. But secondly, we think they're stakeholders of your movements who opt into mass capitalism and mass forms of beliefs, which means a lot of women themselves think that women don't deserve rights. We think this is important, and public approval is something that changes from time to time for this, which means it's only in our world where you can move on ladders of sympathy and gradations of sympathy to be able to appeal to individuals around you that they deserve rights themselves, and this can only happen in a world of language. What does that look like? Before I move on to what that looks like, why is the counterfactual worse? We think, one, there's more haphazard and there's too many things to focus on. At best, if you focus on urgency, that's why privileged feminism wins, because people within your movement, as Pratyush described to you in LO, decide what's most urgent. Who are the people within your movement who control it? People who are Brahmin, people who are upper caste, people who are white, because they have more power than you to dictate what is more urgent than you, because your voice is very little. In that world, at least on our side of the house, in our worst case scenario, our benefits trickle down to individuals who are lower caste, trickle down to disprivileged individuals because they're based in universality. More on that in a minute. But secondly, all the way to what you to choose what is important is arbitrary at best, which means the only way you can do that is to maximize utility. What does that look like? No longer having mismanagement of resources and directing it to tangible policy harm benefits, which means when people see that you've succeeded, they see the visibility of your movement, and even more people want to opt into your movement. On a comparative, what's going to happen in their world is because you rally for things that are less likely to be successful, the likelihood of those issues to be villainized is significantly larger, and therefore the co-option of these needs can happen through a more Western lens, which means if you have too much to focus on, you're likely going to have a burnout because you don't know what to focus on, and Western feminism can co-opt your needs to begin with. But why is it then our case is then better? And I'm going to make this really clear in terms of the fact that what happens in our world. One, in terms of, we talked about how by the virtue of having more success, you have more visibility of the feminist movement. So a greater opt into those movements to begin with. Or as a comparative, that visibility will never come about because you're talking about urgent issues where people can dream, but that dream will never come about because at best it's going to be limited to intellectual circles of women. That never trickles down because you can at best decide within the movement, but you can't appeal to women outside your own movement who are your stakeholders. But secondly, it becomes the breeding ground for benefits of basic rights. Things like education, and this is what I mean by accessibility language. Apala and Hemant talked to you about this. What is the most likely to succeed is one where accessibility to language is easiest. So the most amount of people or common people can understand it. And this is important. For example, understanding how feminism can benefit men, understanding it's not as a humanist movement, but therefore policy changes that look like maternity benefits, because it's so visceral to see that pregnant women are suffering. Before I move on, I'll take a POI very quickly. Quickly. Okay, I'm just going to move on. Quickly.
The cost for you isn't justified right now. It'll probably be justified for after 40 years when this window is over. So right now, don't ask for it because you can't achieve it.
Yeah. We're happy to bite the bullet there, because what the cost of that is, you are deprived millions of individuals in developing countries who don't have basic rights or access to universal rights that you can otherwise be successful in. And in that world, even if we rally for different things, how do you prioritize it? There's no model on op whatsoever. But secondarily, it's going to remain in the hands of intellectual elite women on their side of the world, because it's never going to trickle down, because the success is very little. And we think manufactured choices are important in this regard, because wives and women in rural India, for example, are often influenced by what men in those households think about feminism as well. And we think those opt-ins are particularly more in our world. At least in our world, if you don't talk about it for 40 years, what you get is more women educated, or more nonsense males educated, so they can decide for themselves what feminism means to them, what catharsis and dreams mean to them. In your world, you have a few people who dictate what it looks like, and a large majority of people who never have the education, access, or universality of language to understand what it is that they need. We think that's why the feminist movement is more justified in dealing with the most vulnerable stakeholder on our side of the world. But on our side of the world, we're making sure that individuals around you, not just like women and men, opt into feminism, because that's the only way we're moving into a world where it's equitable for individuals, because people who cause danger for you must also be convinced that they shouldn't be dangerous. And for these reasons, we're proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the government whip for that fine speech. Now I'd like to call the opposition whip. Here.
Hey guys, am I audible?
Yes, you're perfectly audible.
Cool. Just starting in 3. But before that, Premchand was the first open tournament that I broke at. It's extremely overwhelming to be here. And kudos to OC as well. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, what do you get from side proposition in this debate apart from rhetorics? But let's be charitable to them, right? Deputy verbatim says counterfactual exists because you have...
Pranjal, I'm so sorry to stop you. I think one of the panelists asked us to stop because they were having connectivity issues. I'm so sorry to stop you.
That's all right.
I think...
Ayushman, are you here?
Ayushman's back, I think. I think we can proceed.
If we could get a verbal confirmation from him, that would be...
Hi, I'm so sorry for this. It kind of switched between my data and my Wi-Fi. I think I'm back. Everything's stable again. Really sorry for the interruption.
All right, no issues. I think the government whip can start. Oh, sorry, opposition whip. My bad.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. And what you get from side proposition in this debate, apart from rhetorics, are these things, and I'm going to break it down for you, right? The counterfactual that we get from deputy is that other communities are going to support you, except as a movement, you want to shirk off burden and onus to force vulnerable stakeholders that rely on you as a harbinger of social change. We think not only is that argument principally and morally abhorrent, they haven't mechanized how this pans out in status quo, right? Except if they have a problem with value judgment, in their world they care more about end results. Worse, in their world, simply because they're quantifying whose oppression can be lessened. We think that's utility for them. They can't co-opt benefits of vulnerable stakeholders being better on theirs. In that regard, if their visibility is built on the backs of rich Hindu privileged feminists getting emancipated, if that's how success is defined in their words, we think as a movement they really have failed to defend all of these things, right? Because taking their premise, if conservative societies exist in developing worlds, your solution to that sort of a problem is given to the norms that go ahead and oppress you, where you stay shackled for a very long time, right? We think galvanization of basic rights is an exclusive on either side, simply because they can't ask us to defend no human rights for women in developing worlds. We think that's a wrong framing of this debate to begin with, right? But lastly, they go ahead and give you this. They say disadvantaged women and women who are in abject poverty aren't a stakeholder for your movement. Not only is it a gross generalization on their part, but also go ahead and justify not caring about their needs, which is something that's antithetical to the principle of the movement to begin with, right? But if Gust's case is conformism, their idea is to soften your rhetoric, make goals more palatable, except it comes at the cost of compromisation of the same ideals of your movement, which dilutes the message of the movement, something that we've proven to you by 2 speeches down, right? Except the things that you deprioritize are going to have one static thing, something that they never engage with, right? Which is to say, you won't have anything anti-state, which is to say, when a populist government can get away by making tokenistic policies like metro fare being free for all women rather than engaging with changing legislation for sexual harassment, we think that's the kind of comparative that we want to hold them accountable for, something that they'll never do, right? Even if you're rallying for multiple causes, we are okay as long as you don't care about oppressors more than your own stakeholders, something that they never go ahead and engage with, because the threshold of success and who decides it is contingent on the oppressor willing to concede, not the world you want to envisage for yourself. In that regard, if the end goal in this debate for them is public support, we think emancipation in their world only comes by the hands of the oppressor. We think it never trickles down to the masses, because it also has an impact on the stances you take as a movement. We think dissent in their world is highly unlikely, right? In that sort of regard, all of this is dictated by the palatability of the masses. You go ahead and co-opt into the structures you vowed yourself to break down as a movement. We don't see any benefit coming from their side. Except then the idea becomes that you suddenly will have more visibility and more allies joining your movement. Except that's wrong, right? You're going to take the stances to appease the oppressor. You distance yourself from supporting the most vulnerable because uplifting them is going to look like a lost cause. We think if they're going to care about numbers and resources, not need for awareness and urgency, we think in that sort of regard, the trade-off in this debate becomes about who to cater to better, right? In that sort of regard, we think value and resistance and activism stems from you going ahead and preserving an ideological consistency, something that they let go of the second at which they can't do anything anti-state. In that sort of a scenario, we think the way legislations change, and this is literally how pressure groups work, right? You have protesters, you have rioters who go ahead and rally for causes that the government isn't willing to concede to. We think people aren't going to do that in their world simply because when your movement will delegitimize anything you do that is not conformist in nature is a problem that they never deal with. The way overturn window works is that you ask for radical demands to normalize your need to work on women's issues. They're going to be okay with policies to stagnate, to just say maternity leave. You're never going to advocate for legislative change to address important issues that seem too radical in conservative societies. We think in that regard also the way intersectionality also works, as a movement you're going to celebrate and talk about how you've succeeded benefiting the privileged creamy layer when it's unlikely you're going to rally for Dalit women because it's a long run battle, something that you don't want on your side. In that sort of regard, what's the comparative on side opposition? We'll tell you how movements currently need to prioritize celebrating and reclaiming the differences from the mainstream. An example of this is the LGBT movement in the 1960s, which went ahead and openly celebrated and affirmed sexual differences. Except trying to minimize and hide traits that differentiate groups from the mainstream is subconsciously buying into dominant majoritarian views about what is accepted and what is not accepted. It reinforces the social norms you're fighting against. So while you might get certain concessions, which is the best case on side government, you don't change the majority's worldview altogether. Because we think as a movement, your primary aim should be to provide a safe space where members can feel safe rather than just trying to change the minds of people who might not actually want to change to begin with. In that sort of regard, their over-dependency is going to be on fickle allies because people who only ally with the movement because their demands are somewhat aligning with majoritarian views are likely to withdraw support once the movement tries to push for something that's more radical. In that sort of a scenario, for them to argue organic change, they really needed more mechanization except for just saying that in one line. In a world where the government can clamp down on you, monopoly of violence lies with the government, we think protesting is always seen as a lost cause. We think dissent and discourse is one that we preserve on our side simply because you incentivize people to rally for your cause no matter how lost it may seem. We think that's the reason why people went ahead even in the suffragette movement, right? The reason or the value you attach to activism and resistance is simply because you show individuals that systemic barriers can be dealt with, and it's unlikely that these people are going to see value in rallying for causes in their world simply because of the narrative that they okay propagating, right? In that sort of regard, we think value of hope and aspirations to social movements is also something that this debate is really about. When social norms dictate what your life looks like, when you're born into disadvantaged groups by the virtue of lottery of birth, what your opportunities look like, our world challenges these, showing people that they have free will in changing these issues, right? Because simply structural barriers and systemic changes are something that you can never rally for simply because you can't undo 200 years of patriarchy. In that sort of regard, you still want people to have the ability to rally for causes that seem like a lost cause simply because there's this value to resistance that people currently hold because of the ideology that your movement also holds dear, right? The reason you tell little girls that they can aspire to do anything even though their opportunities and access is extremely limited is because you want them to grow up aspiring to do the same, right? We think breaking glass ceiling in male-dominated spheres and power structures becomes a likelihood in our world. In theirs, you're going to tell them that they should give up simply because that's not the metric of success that they define on theirs. Not only is that principally abhorrent with the things that the movement sets out for, but lastly, you're going to undo every structural change that the feminist movement has gone out rallying against the state, rallying against conformism, rallying against majoritarian views. We think you undo all of that with your one move. For all of those reasons, for them never proving the burdens that they take in this debate, reply is far too late to swing that. Extremely proud to take this one.
I'd like to thank the opposition whip for that fine speech. Now I'd like to call the opposition reply to conclude the case for side op. Here.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, please visualize this. You've got 80 years to live in your life. 40 of those, Mozain says, are going to go to waste because your cause isn't justified, because numbers aren't attached to them. Don't go ahead and ask for it. You're never going to get it. We're going to prioritize our attention more on things that are going to be more important. Here's the thing. When individuals go ahead and show anger, when individuals go ahead and express emotion, when individuals go ahead and think of the world as a reimagined world where they're seen as equals, that's a win in itself. Let alone the oppressive structure craving in or giving in to any demand. The kind of hope, the kind of catharsis that it gives individuals just to say that, listen, I'm equal to you, despite them belonging to any strata, any section, is something that they're going to take away on their front. And here's what their response is. It's dynamic. It's going to come 100 years later. Yeah, they start with human rights. And here's the thing. If you want to go ahead and ask for human rights, you can go ahead and ask for human rights in our world also. I beg you not to believe this. There is a certain amount of reasonability that exists in the kind of causes that we rally for, irrespective of it being met on urgency, it being met on the end being justified, it being met on the numbers being attached behind it, it being met on language barriers. Any justification that they possibly can give for you going ahead and asking for human rights also exists on our world, and the movement goes ahead and does the same. But the bigger problem that they had to deal with here is prove why do these movements have an obligation to quite often, and the vast majority of cases, be well received. Here's the thing. The oppressor and the overturning of 400 years of marginalization, victimization, slavery, colonialism, and their response to all of this is still stay patient. They have to give you rights. No, I have 80 years to live, and all I want is to express anger, is to express rage, and I have the bloody well right to go ahead and do that. No response in terms of what hope is, of what catharsis is. To that, their entire response to our bloody entire case on a principled ground is we're willing to bite the bullet. No, the aftermaths of what happens after you bite the bullet are very severe, are very serious. What is the threshold of this success? Their case doesn't evolve beyond wage gap and human rights. It's restricted in policies where you interact with reasonably allied men. That is why the language point was taken down in top half only when they went ahead and said that, listen, accessibility to language is where you go ahead and have the vast majority of rights being given to you. No, wants are meted out and met quite easily in places where you interact with more reasonably allied men. That's where reasonability or probability of success of a cause come from. Where do you go ahead and find women who rally in those places? Oh, you blight. These are places like Delhi. These are places like Bombay. How are you going ahead and helping the vulnerable in their world? We have no clue. But here's the biggest thing. Their claim that human rights in India are shit. All right, let me concede to that. There was a huge uproar on something which was the decriminalization of Section 377 of the IPC. This was about you having carnal intercourse if it wasn't between a man and a woman. Their response to that, and this is literally lying through their noses, we did this because we had transgender people in the parliament. We did this because we had institutional support. What are you lying on? What are you saying? These things don't exist in practicality. These things aren't the real world. They appease two majorities in their world. Creamy layer of women within the movement, outside the movement, men, because all they're contingent on and all their wants are contingent on are what the oppressor deems necessary and deems fit to be given to you. That's exactly what causes should be based on. That's exactly what causes are legitimate to rally for. Their argument can't possibly be we have too much on our plate to ask for. Yes, individual pockets of movements ask for individual things. That doesn't mean you go ahead and say and ignore entire pockets and fragments of movements simply by saying your cause is too liberal and too woke to be achieved in this generation. Wait for another generation of leaders to come ahead and ask for the same. No, that ability to dream isn't on the oppressor's hand, isn't in the hand of the creamy layer within the movement. It's on you. We want a world where you can go ahead and ask for an overhaul of this world, of this shitty world that you don't want to live in. We want a world where you can go ahead and reimagine yourselves as equal. They say it's not urgent. We say it's highly imperative. We're proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition reply for that fine speech. Now I'd like to call upon the government reply to conclude the case on side government. Here.
All right. I won't waste much time. I hope I'm audible. Any one of you can confirm me.
Yes, you're perfectly audible.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. After Pratyush's speech, you hear 2 conventional debate speeches. At the very best, they just tell you value of dreams, but never materialize and ground debate into actual realities. I'm going to quickly look over 3 arguments in this debate. First of all, do you appease to majority, how you appease to majority, what you abandon, what you gain. Secondly, how it's likely going to achieve the process of basic rights, and then I'm going to talk about compromise and ideological consistency. But the first thing you need to know about is that this debate exists in counterfactual, guys. In every moment, you have to prioritize one thing over another, which means after Pratyush's speech, the next 2 speakers just forgot there was a counterfactual concept in this debate, which means if we don't prioritize, for instance, we prioritize utility, they'll have to prioritize something else. In absence of them not carrying forward their argument, we are going to assume it was random, arbitrary, and unthoughtful. That's the point at which, for elite people, it's easy to capture your feminist movement and exclude other individuals. That's the point at which my both speakers will talk about how privileged feminism actively alienates vast majority of women within the grounds because they never relate to the ideas that you're talking about. That's when the higher magnitude of harm takes place. They never defended counterfactual. They also have to make a choice, mind you, Madam Speaker. We aren't the only side that are making a choice. At any point of time, have they defended what their choice would look like? Have they mechanized their model? Apala, me, and Muzain have been more than clear in what our model looks like, what are the parameters of defining success, and they're being as inclusive as possible. Secondly, then they have like, oh, we'll let the people dream. I'll let us 13-year-old girl dream. What's the value of dreaming if it will never materialize? That's far more damaging for you. But then say, we'll just bring an overnight revolution. I don't know, probably CBS taught them. There are 2 problems with that. First problem, governments easily say that you're radicals. They'll ostracize you. They'll constantly sideline you. They'll marginalize you in ways that you can't imagine, because you have to acknowledge there is an asymmetry of power. What we say when women bite the bullet is because oftentimes we are more than happy to have small incremental and concessional change as opposed to moving to the most radical conception of asking for change. In those instances, what happens is state finds it much easier for you to just entirely sideline and sequester your rights and have no conception of right whatsoever. Did they ever engage with that? No, they didn't. In that instance, what happens and how the concept of appeasing to majorities take place? We give you 4 lines of contestation on that. First of all, we think appeasing to majorities is a monolith. Social consciousness keeps changing through basic rights, and social morals also progress along the line. That's why we said, even if you achieve one basic right now, that gives you more support, that gives you more legitimacy, that gives you more allies, and therefore you can move on to higher rights. You can't leapfrog to higher rights without even having any basic conception of rights. Then they talk about we can also have basic rights. But Madam Speaker, there is a difference. The reason why we can claim that is because we say basic rights are more likely to succeed than any kind of rights. And there is analysis, not just simple assertions. Because they're universal in nature, they have an economic utility and they have a social utility. People are always aspiring to that. That's why you can argue abolishing of female feticide, because there is a basic utility and humanness associated to it. Give me, why can you achieve it just besides saying that you can achieve it? At the same point, we tell you can achieve wage gap because there is a utility associated to it. That's the reason why the universal conception of rights is much more preferable on our side of the house. But then we also tell you that in a lot of instances, oftentimes the idea of majorities keeps on changing. For instance, in Egypt, there was Sabah Mahmood was able to ask for women's rights to enter into mosques. In Pakistan, we talk about how trans bill and semi-trans acquisition of rights was able to take place. All of these things happen at all points of time because we believe dynamism of society keeps on changing. And that's why our analysis on developing countries is incredibly important. Developing countries aren't imbued with the most liberal ideas. People move on from basic conscious and basic liberal values to more liberal values. You can't throw away the most radical concept on their face and then expect those individuals to bring anything about that process. In that instance, at the very best, on opposition's world, you have huge jargon and rhetoric, no grounding of what that would look like in majority of the cases. Give me a single example of a single policy they passed for women. Not a single example, not a single illustration of what that would look like. We give you a realistic conception, and that's the biggest reason we win this debate, because even though our conception of rights isn't the most hunky-dory world, but it's the most realistic and most grounded conception of the world. You can move on from that and achieve higher degree of rights, because from basic rights you move towards progressive rights, not the other way around. Therefore, appeasing towards institutions is important. Then the last argument is that you'll often abandon. What is that you're abandoning? I'm not really sure. Because if they are saying basic rights, we already co-opted that argument right from our first speech. You'll always be able to achieve rights. What is that some core feminist value that you'll abandon if you pursue that? More importantly, we tell you, the women who want to achieve solace, and Apala also said this in speech, they'll still find solace within feminist movement. That solace isn't predicated upon you lobbying for them, because there are so many issues that feminist movement has to lobby for. That by that logic, only those women for whose issues feminist movement is lobbying for them will find solace. There are multiple women who can still access feminist movement, but at the end of the day, it's a value judgment. Please look in your sheets and tell me what's the counterfactual was, what their conception of that was. I mean, CD speeches don't win you parliamentary debates, do they? Thank you.
I'd like to thank the government reply for that speech.